welcome back to Emissaire. My name is Jacob, and in today's video we're going to be continuing our topic from the previous video, which was JavaScript conditionals. So if you guys haven't seen that video, I'm going to link it up at the top in the cards. Please go check it out before you watch this video because it is related and we are going to be continuing what we covered in the last video. So last week, as you guys can see here on my screen, we went through a bunch of conditions. So we learned how to set up a block of if, else if, and else's so that they run in sequence and only one of them gets hit. We also looked at how multiple ifs can both be triggered, and that's why we have the else if and the else. And lastly, we learned about the else, the final else statement, which is kind of tricky to use sometimes because if none of your conditions match, it will always hit that. And the example that I gave last time was that if we pass in a wrong data type, and if you haven't checked out the data types, please go check that video as well. If you pass in a wrong data type, which is not covered by your condition, then it'll still hit the else, and sometimes that's not what we want. Looking back at this, we only use numbers, so we're only comparing two numbers. We're using the greater or equal to right here, and here, and here, and we're using the less than over here. And it's easy to compare two numbers because they're both numbers, so the interpreter knows exactly what to do to compare them. It just subtracts one from the other and tries to find out if it was negative or positive, and then it knows which way to go, if it was true or false. So that's easy to do when what you're comparing is both of the same type. If you have a number and a number, or if you have a string and a string, you can say, are these two equal, or is one greater than the other? And it'll tell you if that's true. Now, the problem arises in JavaScript, especially when you have different data types being compared. So let me show you guys what I mean. I'm going to start off actually here with a meme. I'm just going to open up my browser here. I got this Patrick meme when he drops his wallet, and it just goes through the equivalence fiasco. So he starts off here with Mandark saying, or Man Ray, I guess his name, Man Ray, saying the number 0 is equal to the string of 0. And Patrick says true. Then we go over here and it says 0 is equal to an empty array. And that is also true. The number 0 is equal to an empty array. And that is also true. So Man Ray then puts those two together and says, well, if 0 is equal to the string of 0, and 0 is also equal to the empty array, then these two guys right here, the string of 0 and the empty array, must be equal to each other. And Patrick, which is JavaScript, says, well, that makes sense to me. So then when Man Ray positions it to him, JavaScript says false, and it is false, so we can actually check it right here. Let's get rid of all these, and we're just going to say console.log. We're just going to say, actually let's start with the exact same way he did it. So 0 equals 0, that's true. And just like last time, I'm using the JavaScript REPL to print out exactly what we're seeing on the page without having to open up the browser or any other kind of debugger. And then we're going to do 0 equals empty array, and that is also true. And then when we do the final one, 0 equals empty array, it gives us false. So Man Ray's not getting there, and neither is Patrick. So it's kind of weird to see these things when you actually play around with it like this, because it should make sense. If A equals B and A equals C, right? That's how it works here, because 0 is, if you consider 0A, then by like some kind of transitive property, then B should equal to C, because they actually equal each other up here. But in JavaScript, that's not the case, because the way it converts the types is different depending on what type you start with. And that's why when you start with the number, you get trues up here, but when you start with a string, it does some different kind of type conversion. And so my whole point for this video is to get you guys familiar with this concept, with how JavaScript equates things and how it finds the truthiness of it. And by the way, JavaScript is not the only language to do this. Python will do this as well. If you pass in a valid array to Python, it'll tell you that that's something true. If you pass in something else, it might tell you that it's false, depending on what it is, right? So JavaScript is not the only one that does these kind of, some people would call silly equivalents, but it's one of the most notorious ones that gets a lot of heat for it. So let's just jump into here. So last time we learned about the 5 different data types, the primitive types that we're going to be using every day, and then there was also 2 other ones which we will not consider just for now. And they were string. No, sorry. We're going to start with Boolean, number, string, null, and undefined. And I'm just writing these down for you guys here so that you have a reference of what we're talking about. So we're going to say, now back to the conditionals. So why am I bringing this up? The conditionals, remember how we had a two numbers being compared using a greater or equal to sign there? Well, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to just pass in a value. So we're going to say if x, and x could be any of these 5 different types. So we're going to say if, for example, if true. We already saw this before, that if true, we're just going to try to say that. Well, we're just going to say this is truthy. And that's how JavaScript denotes it, with truthy values. So we're going to say if true, then it's truthy. And obviously true must be truthy. It is the most basic truthy value. Now if we say false, this doesn't get run anymore. That's the falsey value. So truth is true in Booleans. There's only 2. So truth is truthy, false is falsey. Very, 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 very logical. And it only gets weirder from here. Now, let's jump onto numbers. So if I say 1, 1 is truthy. 2 is truthy. 3 is truthy. -1 is truthy. -100 is truthy. Every number is truthy except for the value 0. And as you can see, it's not printing it anymore here. So 0 is a falsy value. So in terms of Booleans, true is true, false is false. In terms of numbers, everything is truthy except for the value 0. Now let's go to strings. We're going to say John. John is truthy. Any string, and as you can see here, J, O, however long the string is, it will equivalent it to truthy, except when we have the empty string. The empty string is falsy. So here we have, it doesn't run here. It's actually not running this console.log because we put an empty string here. So in strings, every string with a length greater than 0 is truthy. The only one that's not is the empty string. And then these last 2 conditions, null and undefined. Null is falsy, and so is undefined. And I got a quick chart over here to show you guys. Here it is. So we're using the if keyword. We're not doing the equals, the equivalent check yet. We're just doing if. So if we just do if value. So here it's checking these values. So true, obviously we know that's true. False is false. Here we get into the numbers. So we can see that any number other than 0 is falsy. And then here's all the strings. Any string, you can see all of these strings have a length. This one has a length 4, 5, 1, 1, and 2. Because it's minus and then the 1. So everything with a length is green, which means it's true. But the empty string right here, which we checked, is false. null and undefined, the special types I call them, because they don't really hold value, they're just kind of placeholders themselves. They're both always falsy. So if you check null and undefined, they're always falsy, and your code will never go through at that path. Now here's some special numbers, or I guess placeholders for numbers: infinity and negative infinity. And these infinity and negative infinity are technically numbers, and so just like the way numbers work, these will always be true as well. This is an array, it's always true. This is an object, this is a nested array, it doesn't change. This is an array with a 0, this is an array with a 1. It doesn't change things. These are all truthy. The only thing that is not at the bottom here is something called not a number, and we will look at that later. It doesn't really fall into any of the types we mentioned. It's kind of a special object itself, and it's only used for evaluating if something is a number or not. Now, if you look at this list, you can see that we have the 5 basic types that we started with when we looked at our types. We have the booleans, we have numbers, strings, null, and undefined. So in every of those categories, there is one falsy value. In boolean, it's false. In numbers, it's 0. In strings, it's the empty string. And then in null, it's null. In undefined, it's undefined. So null and undefined actually do not have a truthy value associated with them. They're always falsy. So that's the way I remember it, that in every of those 5 types, there is at least one, there is only one falsy value, and these are them here. So let's go back to our VS Code. So here, I'm just going to write them down for you guys. So false equals false. Here we're going to say 0. 0 equals false. Empty string equals false. Null equals false. And undefined equals false. So these are all the falsy values here. There's one of each of these types. And then not a number, which we won't look into right now. Now, that's just using if statements. If you just pass in that object itself, if you pass in a number, or if you pass in undefined or a string, this is when it evaluates it to those truthy or falsy values. But what if we were to check if 2 things were equal? So let's say we have the number 1, and we use equals equals to check the equality. And here we have console.log truthy, and it's printing truthy out because 1 is being converted to the number 1. So this is how we check if 2 things are equal, and in this case, the string of 1 is equal to the number 1, and that's because we are using this equals equals operator, and this equals equals operator is actually the non-strict version, which means the two values that you are comparing do not have to be the same type. It'll actually convert both of them into one type. I guess it's the second one. It'll convert both of them into one type, and it'll check after converting. If we used equals equals equals, suddenly you don't get that anymore, because now it's not doing the conversion anymore. It's just checking strict equality. Are these 2 strictly equal? Well, they're not, because they're not even the same. They're not even the same type. So that's why this doesn't run. Now, let's go back to our handy dandy chart here, and I will post this in the description below so that you guys can get familiar with it. It's super important to learn. Here is where the chaos comes in. So if you guys look at this chart here, you can see all kinds of wacky stuff. So look, true equals true. It also equals the number 1, but it does not equal the negative 1, which is bizarre because we know that negative numbers are truthy, and yet they do not equal the Boolean true. So when you take the Boolean, convert it to a number, it does not equal negative 1. It actually only equals 1 because true converts to the number 1. It's very weird, and this is just the scratching the surface. True also equals the list, the array with the number 1 in it. This really boggles my mind. I don't even know how you can convert this to that, but somehow they did it. And this is the kind of stuff to expect when you are using equals equals. So if you do 1 and the string of 1, which is over here, you see that right here, this little green block, this guy right here, this is true. This kind of makes sense because the number 1 converted into a string becomes the string of 1. That makes perfect sense. But some other stuff completely don't make sense. Like, how is undefined equal to null? You guys see this? Undefined is equal to null. They're supposed to be completely different types, but I guess they're both empty. So maybe it's a way of saying they're both placeholders. Infinity doesn't equal anything except for infinity. Negative infinity doesn't equal anything else except for negative infinity, which I guess that makes sense. But the empty here, the empty array equals false and 0, and the empty string. But remember we said there's a falsy value if you pass it into the if for each of those types. Well, null and undefined are both falsy themselves, like just by themselves if you pass them into the if. But here in this case, they're not equating to an empty array. So there's a bit of weird stuff going on here. And I mean, if you can try to memorize this map, but believe me, that does not help you when you're working with a large code base. So instead, I'm just going to shift over here to the equals, which we already said is the strict operator. It does not convert the values for you. It simply checks if they are the same type and the same value of the type. Now, if you look at this, this is so much easier to understand. Everything is equal to each other. Sorry, everything is only equal to itself. True is equal to true, false is equal to false, 1 is equal to 1, 0, and so forth. The parts that are not equal here is the empty array, the empty object, the array of arrays, which falls under the array category, all these other arrays, which also fall into array categories, and then the not a number. So not a number is actually not equal to not a number. And we'll go through these later. These are actually special types because they are JavaScript objects themselves. Even the array is technically a JavaScript object. And if you're expecting an object or an array, there are ways to get around this. And you can check either a stringified version of the object or the array, or you can check the length, or you can create a function which checks each of the values in there. There are many ways to do it, and it's a lot better than running into this. So my whole point for this is saying that, you know, moral of the story here, this guy Dore has already put it for us. Always use 3 equal signs unless you have a good reason to use 2. And believe me, there is not much good reasons to use 2. There might be sometimes when you're trying to check nulls and undefined, but it's always better to check the 3 equal signs. So that is equality. And as you can see, it doesn't really match up to this. This whole scenario here does not match up to the if. The reason I started with the if is because you are going to be using if false or if 0 or if empty string. And the way I use those is, let's say we're getting we're making an API call to some kind of stock library, and let's say, I don't know, they have some data in there which sometimes it'll just return to you that a stock is actually worth 0. Doesn't really happen much, but sometimes it happens. Let's say you're getting a 0. Well, a 0 to us is actually the same thing as null, because it's kind of telling us that this stock doesn't really exist, or the pricing for it does not exist in this time frame. So how I would check that is, I would just say, let's say the value is coming in as like dot value. So I would just say stock dot value, and I would just say if stock dot value, and then if it is, then I would print it. Otherwise, I would say, I would say like maybe, sorry, this is no value. Sorry, please try again. No data at this point. Whatever my catch could be. But for that, it makes perfect sense to catch the zeros as falsy values, because 0 is telling you that there's no data technically in this case. Now, sometimes 0, depending on what your API is doing, sometimes 0 is data. For example, like how many, if we're looking at like the state of affairs with COVID, if you say how many COVID deaths were there in this certain region, 0 is telling you that actually it is a number 0. There has been 0 deaths. So you would have to kind of understand exactly what your API is giving you to understand what to do with those values. So in certain cases, a 0 could mean null, it could mean false, or it could mean that it is actually representing the real number 0. And the reason for that is because some APIs will use whatever database they use, Postgres or MongoDB in the backend. However they do it, they will always give a default. So if it's a number value that they're allowing their clients to input, or they're allowing somebody else to input, or they're pulling from somewhere, if it's a number value, they will usually default 0 as the, if there's no data, it just defaults to 0. So if you know that the default is 0, then you have to treat it as a null. So you can say if whatever value, and that'll treat it as a null automatically based on this chart that we're looking at. But if you know that it's not actually a default, and actually it's a signifier of something that is actually 0, then you would have to treat it, you would have to say if stock.value or whatever, or if num deaths equals 0. So you're checking if it is the actual number 0, then you would do something. Otherwise, maybe you could do an else block in there, and you know that if it's not 0, then it's something else, and then you can do whatever else you need to do with it there. So that's how I check these weird falsy values. And sometimes I've worked on APIs where if they allow the user to type in, let's say, a paragraph for some kind of rich text editor, maybe they're doing a description for a movie or a website or whatever it is. Sometimes if they haven't typed in anything, it actually comes in as empty strings, because in the database, they're using the empty string as a default. So we can capture that empty string and just say, hey, if let's say the value is called paragraph. So we're gonna say if paragraph, we just pass in paragraph. And the if will do everything for us. So if it's empty, if it's just empty string, then we can just skip that entire if. But if there's something actually in there, let's say there's an actual sentence in there, we can take that sentence and do something with it, because it will actually run into our if block. So that's a couple ways of understanding how the falsy values are used. And sorry, I didn't really give too much examples in today's video, but we will definitely be taking a closer look at this, especially with the ones that we missed, which was the not a number, the objects, and the arrays. We will have a complete video for objects, a complete video for arrays, because there is a lot to go through there. And we will double check the truthiness of those object and array values in there, and then finally the not a number. So I hope you guys focus through this. I hope you guys learned something from this, and I really hope that what you guys learned was to use the 3 equals signs. So again, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope that this taught you something about the truthy values in JavaScript. Please comment below if you guys liked it, if you learned something, if anything was unclear, and I'll try to clear it up. And thank you guys so much, and catch us in the next one.